Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Perry here with Circle founder Robert Perry, and today we're talking about how to be more loving. The inspiration for this discussion comes from two things. Number one, being more loving is clearly needed in our world right now. And two, Robert and I have been very inspired lately by a section in the text of A Course in Miracles that is new to the complete and annotated edition called The Journey into Fear. Now, The Journey into Fear has a whole backstory, which we'll get into in just a moment, but the heart of its message is that we discover the love in us by getting rid of the hate in us. And we're going to talk today about how the Course says we can do this. As an aside, for the life of me, I cannot understand why the Course is so often accused of spiritual bypassing when it's forever asking us to do things like what we're asked to do in this section, which is look at our hatred and the ways in which we are actively choosing it over love. One thing I do understand, though, is that we do not like to talk about our hate. It is super uncomfortable. It's one of those things we will do just about anything to avoid looking at, which is exactly what this section is about, and possibly why it didn't make it into the Course in the first place. But as long as we avoid looking at this side of us, then it will continue to operate unconsciously, shaping how we see things, sabotaging our relationships, and causing so much destruction in our world. And so I know we have called this podcast How to Be More Loving, but again, for the purposes of our discussion today, looking at our hate is how we become more loving. So that's a good chunk of what we're going to be focused on. But stick with us, because I promise in the end it will be liberating, and I mean that. Robert, I mentioned that we're going to center our discussion on the section of the text called The Journey into Fear. Before we get into the content of that section, though, I think it would be helpful to give a little bit of the backstory of that section. It did not appear in the original text of the Course, and to be fair, it didn't appear in our original text publication of the Course until just a few years ago. So tell us about this section. Where did it come from, and why was it originally omitted from the Course?
It was simply part of the dictation of the course. So it's right there in Helen's notes where everything in the course is. And yet it was clearly deemed personal to them. It's talking directly about their relationship, but a lot of things in the course are talking directly about their relationship. All those holy relationship discussions that will come a number of chapters later are talking about their relationship. So it became like it was stored in typewritten form in the special messages, okay, not in the text. But the fact is that there are a number of special messages that made it into the course, like the famous section, I Need Do Nothing, or the branching of the road. So there are these things that originally were personal, but there's no distinct line between what's personal and what's in the course. So other things that were deemed personal, put in the special messages, made it into the course, and this didn't. And we'll talk about that, but it's very curious and it's a little bit suspicious.
The Journey into Fear section is only 4 paragraphs long, and you found them significant enough to devote a cameo to them. Cameos are essays written by you. In the back of the complete and annotated edition, you'll see that cameo 21 is called You Do Not Realize How Much You Hate One Another. So all 4 of the paragraphs that appear in the Journey into Fear section do appear in the cameo, But for the new printing of the CE, they were moved from the cameo into the text. Tell us why you felt that this material belonged in the text itself.
The short version of that is that it acted like part of the flow of teaching in the text, and without it, there was a big hole that was left. So, on a very minor level, this this four paragraph section refers back to other passages that precede it. But more important than that, there were two sections that come after it that grow directly out of it. Okay, and we'll talk a bit more about this, but the very next section is a continuation of the same discussion. And then in the next chapter, chapter 13, there's a section called The Fear of Redemption. And the fear of redemption starts out with a direct reference to this section. And so in all other published editions of the course, that section, The Fear of Redemption, starts out by referring to a section that's not there. It's
Mm-hmm.
not present. And much of that section is an answer to what's raised at the beginning of it, which again is a direct reference to these four paragraphs. So there's a hole, this acts like part of the flow of the teaching in the text, and then there's a hole when it's left out. So that was what initially made us add it in. But since then, we've discovered a very significant reference to it in Bill's journal. And Bill's keeping a journal at the very time that this material comes through. And we'll talk about this, but that that section of Bill's journal shows, first of all, Helen and Bill reacting seismically to this material, and it shows the potential motive for conveniently neglecting to put it into the text.
Right. So there's two things going on there that I want to get into. One is, just to be clear, these four paragraphs were originally in Helen's notes. They were right there, but they didn't appear in the text. You found them in Helen's notes, thought that they were too personal to Helen and Bill, but too good to leave out. And so you wrote a cameo about them and talked about them in Cameo 21 of the course, but then realized as you're going through chapter 12 of the text and chapter 13 that he does a lot of hearkening back. He'll say things like "we said before," and you'll put footnotes connecting where he says "we said before" to what was said before to make the link easy for the reader. But there were references in chapter 12 and 13 to things that appear in those four paragraphs, but those four paragraphs weren't in the text. And so that's what ultimately made you decide to put them there. Is that
That
right?
was the beginning of the process. So I'm writing commentary, and also looking at things that need new footnotes in our subsequent printing of the CE, which was our revised edition. And first of all, I realized, well, the very next section is called Looking at the Cause of Fear. And based on that section, it was really hard to understand what the cause of our fear was. You really needed this material to understand what that section is talking about. And then I'm looking at whenever he says things like remember, it's often a reference to earlier passages. And so in that next chapter, chapter 13, he opens the fear of redemption section by saying, you may wonder why it's so crucial to look upon your hatred and recognize its full extent. Well, that sounds like he's saying you may wonder this about this thing I talked about before. And I did all these searches for it, and I could not find any reference to the need to look upon our hatred and recognize its full extent. And then I realized, oh, wait, that's a direct reference to this material that was deemed a personal message. So, that was the beginning of the process of realizing, hang on, leaving this thing out leaves a hole in the text.
And then it got even more interesting with Bill's journal. So, talk about the connection between Bill's journal and this section that was that we're talking about?
So this section was dictated over 2 days, September 13th and 14th of 1966. That's when Bill's keeping a journal. Okay. And he's got 2 paragraphs of his journal headed with the heading notes covering September 13th and 14th. So he's talking about these very notes. And we'll go into this in more detail, but they spend 2 afternoons trying to integrate this material, the afternoons of the 13th and 14th. And Helen's having this massive panic attack over the material. Um, so all of that is very revealing for a couple of reasons.
Okay, so let's go into the content of the material itself. What is it that made Helen so uncomfortable? What is the heart of the message in The Journey into Fear?
Well, before we dive directly into that, I feel like there's a bit of a setup to help us appreciate what that section says. And the setup in my mind goes like this. Everyone on the spiritual path is trying to become more loving. However, they're trying to do that, whether they're just abiding in presence, where they're facing, their various patterns, whether they're trying to affirm, whatever they're doing, we're all trying to become more loving. And I think based on just living life, you realize that pretty much everyone on earth at least has the intention of becoming more loving. It's a universal aspiration. But how do we achieve this goal? The fact is, it looks like we are not very good at becoming more loving. Even people who profess to be centered on love, I think we know they can be impossible to deal with. They can be callous. They can be vindictive. They can be self righteous. So, how can we do a better job at becoming more loving? And the advice that Jesus gives in this section, the last thing we'd ever expect to hear is that to become more loving, you need to look at your hate.
Well, that's not exactly what we would expect him to say. I mean, I guess if you've been a course student for long enough, that's the kind of thing that you would expect him to say. But if you are on the spiritual path, just looking to become more loving, to be told, look at your hate and get rid of your hate, and that's how you become more loving, it 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 may be a bit of a surprise. It certainly was a surprise to Helen. And yet what we have right in the introduction to A Course in Miracles is that we are clearing the blocks to the expression of love's presence. And so, right there, you have an example of this very idea that the love is already in you. It's not like you become more loving by trying to find more love, it's there. You get the hate out of the way, you clear the blocks to the awareness of love's presence so that you can let that presence come from you cleanly and clearly.
Well, yes, but a couple of things. First of all, when we hear the blocks, we don't think hate. Secondly, I think most of us good spiritual seekers don't think of ourselves as having hate. I think the majority of course students, spiritual seekers in general, think, well, I'm a loving person. I don't have hate. We don't like using that word even. Another thing is that material that you just mentioned was dictated way later. So that was dictated, I think, after the entire text, or maybe the entire course was complete. Helen said, I want a better introduction. And she received that better introduction that is so beautiful and therefore so well known and well loved.
I like how Helen can just, make those requests, whip Jesus into shape, tell him that he
Right.
needs a better introduction, and he delivers. Just
Yeah.
saying. So we are talking about this 4 paragraph section, and it in classic course fashion, there is so much packed into these 4 paragraphs. You've pulled out some key points from the section. I'll just go ahead and read them, and then we can go through them one by one. The key themes of the Journey into Fear section are: we don't realize just how much hate we have in us towards other people. We don't realize the cost of having this hate in us to get rid of the hate, we do need to look at it. And looking at our hate is frightening, but it's ultimately the very thing that can dissolve it. And so let's just go through these one by one. The first point is we don't realize how much hate we have in us towards others. You said it yourself. We're good spiritual people, and we don't like to think that this lives in us. But as long as we don't look at it and admit that it's there, we're not going to see all the trouble it's causing.
That's true. So the section starts out by saying you have no idea of the intensity of your wish to get rid of your brother. Then it says in the next paragraph, you do not realize, again, you do not realize how much you hate your brother. You will not get rid of this until you do realize it. So you won't get rid of the hate until you realize how much is there. For until then, you will think you want to get rid of him and keep the hatred. So he's basically saying, you just have no clue. And I feel like, especially as spiritual people, part of what we're doing here is we're trying to get into this mindset where we say, you know what? I'm really well intentioned. I'm really good. I'm really loving. I affirm myself all the time. And there's
But
no
don't
room.
cross me.
Yeah, there's no room in
Be-
that picture for hate, but it comes out.
yeah, it comes out. One of the things that you like to say that I think is so true is that the people that you meet that are so nice and you think that they don't have an ego, they couldn't possibly, or they have some small ego, you just get to know them a bit better and you realize, oh yeah, it's there. It's there with everyone. And so that's one of the benefits of these kinds of sections in the course, because when he says you would rather get rid of the other person to keep your hate, that's a very direct statement. But at the same time, if we look at our lives and we look at our world, we can see the ways in which this is true. Whether it's the breakup of friendships, the breakup of marriages, being estranged from kids, relationships seem very fragile, and they also seem very disposable these days. People are the best of friends, and then something happens and poof, the relationship's gone. And that to me is evidence that we would rather get rid of each other and keep our hatred than the other way around. So, do you want to speak to that idea, the disposable nature of relationships these days?
Well, I mean, we all see it, I think. We've gotten very on our high horse about how we need to draw boundaries. And basically, if people, don't fit within certain specifications, we do need to dispose of them. I think what I want to say is that I'm very struck, and this is not confined to other people, but for now, I'll say I'm very struck by having known some really nice people in my life who, when I got to know them better, had something much darker in them that, really can be accurately described as hate. And it's shocking to see it come out of somebody whose persona is incredibly nice and gentle and mild. And then you realize, oh my gosh, there's something else in there. It's a shock.
Yeah, you and I were talking about this whole sequence where it goes from easy to hard. So it's easy to look out in the world and say, gosh, there's so much hate in all of these people. What's wrong with the world? And then you go into this phase where you want to surround yourself with the people that we like, the people that we love, the people who we feel have less ego, so that
And
our
share
world
our
becomes
ideals.
more safe. Yeah. And then you realize, oh wait, those people have egos just as much as everyone else. You just didn't see it as clearly before, but when you get up close and personal and spend enough time together, oh, there's the ego. And then so that's hard enough. And then there's another phase where you realize, wait, I'm like that too. I've I've
Yeah.
got I've got this hate in me as well. And so it goes from so easy to look at it out there to having it right in your face from people you love. We'll talk about that, like the hate we feel towards people we love, and then realizing, wait, this lives in me.
Right. I'm glad you brought that part in because that's the hardest part, obviously. It's shocking and scary to find out that the person that you just think is so lovable and adorable, in the end, that there's a coldness in that person that makes you feel alone, like you don't matter, you're just a thing. But to find that it's that same thing is in you, that's the hardest part. What I always think about when we talk about this is there's this old movie from, I think, the 70s. I think I saw it as a teen called When a Stranger Calls. And it was kind of famous back in the day because there's this babysitter and she's alone at home in the at this other family's home, and there's two kids sleeping upstairs, and she keeps getting these calls saying, "Have you checked the children?" And she's getting so scared because the caller seems to know things that he shouldn't know. That she calls the police and they say, "Okay, we'll trace the call," and blah blah blah. And they finally trace the call. They call her and they say, "Get out of there right now. The call is coming from inside the house." And that moment, I remember being in the theater and just being like, like just blew my mind, freaking out. And that's kind of what we're talking about here,
The
where there's
ego is
some
inside the house.
the ego's inside the house, either inside the house in terms of like the person you're with, or inside the house in terms of the house of your own mind.
So I promise we're going to lift this up and talk about how to get
Yeah, we
out
digress.
of all of this. But at the same time, it is good to kind of go into the depths that the course is asking us to go into before we lift ourselves out of it. So I want to move on to your second point, which is that we do have to understand the cost that having this hate in ourselves and in our lives, like what it's actually costing us, because until and unless we do that, we're not going to have the motivation to get rid of it. And so what does the course say about us recognizing the cost of hate in our lives?
There are a number of things the section says, but I feel like for simplicity's sake, we should really boil them down to the idea that the hate covers over our love. Okay, there is love inside of us, but it's obscured by this cover of hate that we don't want to acknowledge. Okay. And things come along with that. What he talks about is you'd rather get rid of your brother and keep the hate. Well, that means you're alone. So that's one cost. He says that it means we prefer attack to salvation, which means prefer hate to salvation. So salvation is a casualty here. We don't get salvation because we want to keep the hate. It says we want to get rid of the love because the love and the hate make us feel like we're in conflict within ourselves, which is a very uncomfortable state. We're loving and hating the same person. That's uncomfortable. The solution in our eyes is get rid of the love. Okay, so what happens is with this hate in us, we end up alone with our hate as our twisted idea of salvation. And we've jettisoned the love or hidden it. We've jettisoned the other person. We've jettisoned salvation. So the costs from the course's standpoint are really everything.
And that is something that I I know the course is asking us to look at, the what we call the bodies in the road. In other words, when you have someone, and maybe you recognize this in yourself, who just constantly has a trail of broken relationships, and it's never their fault as to why there are so many bodies in the road. It's just that's what the ego does. The ego gets in, sabotages our relationships, and then blames the other person for what they did wrong. It's never our fault. It's always theirs. And that's a classic sign of this kind of hatred at work in our lives that sometimes we're not so willing to face.
Part of the human condition is having those bodies, but if the common denominator is you, you've got to be willing to look at your part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And your part of that ultimately comes down to that presence living inside of you that we're describing as hate.
That was one of our classic signs I remember from the projection teachings of the course, where if you're always right and they're always wrong, that is the sign of the ego at work. And the sign of the ego at work is nothing more than the sign of hate, right? That's what the ego does.
Exactly.
It causes us to suffer. So hate feels like this strong word, and if you were thinking, well, I don't hate people, the course broadens it out. Any time the ego's at play in your mind, that's what we're talking about here. That's what's classified under hate.
Well, and what the course is saying is if you don't think that lives in you and is the heart of your ego, then you're not really looking.
Failure of introspection.
Exactly.
So, moving on through our points, the course says that I think we've already kind of covered this, but for as much as we don't want to look at our hate, we have to look at it. Did we already go through that?
No, I don't think we have.
Okay. Well, I feel like we've been weaving that point into
We
the
have.
previous ones, but
Yeah.
let's talk about looking at it.
Well, the idea is that we have to get rid of it, but we can't get rid of it unless we look. So the third paragraph in this section says, look as calmly as you can upon your hatred. And the calmly part's important. For if we are to deny the denial of truth, that's a reference to a preceding section, we must first recognize what we are denying. Now, here, denial is not like repression, it's not stuffing something down in our unconscious. It's saying no to it. It's saying, I choose to let that go. So we can't do that with our hate unless we first look at it. It's like saying there's a piece of trash on the ground on your carpet. How do you throw that away unless you first look at it? If you ignore it, I mean this is the story of my life with house cleaning. If you don't see the things that need cleaning, are they going to get cleaned? No.
No, they invite their friends too. So
Exactly. Yeah.
so same idea, right? Like if you don't dissolve it by looking at it and throwing it away, it just multiplies in your mind, just like the trash multiplies,
That's so
dust
true.
multiplies on the floor. You said something really interesting a minute ago, and I know it's in the section, The Journey into Fear. And this connects to Helen and Bill in ways that we'll talk about in a little bit. But we don't want to look at our hate in general, but we especially don't want to look at our hate towards people we love. And let's go deeper into that idea because again the section specifically addresses it, and it's so much easier to look out there at the things that we hate, maybe admit that, easier to admit, okay, yeah, I've got some hatred towards what's out there, but it's hard to admit that we also have this love hate relationship going on with the people closest to us in our lives. So let's talk about that.
That's true. I think we are more okay with the idea that it's directed out there at enemies, at, past friends and lovers, people who are no longer in the inner circle. And then the idea is, but I'm in this haven with, my favorite person and they're really great friends. And in the haven, there's just love. And that means I'm a good person. It means I'm not alone. And okay, there's the monsters outside the compound, but we all know they're monsters and it's okay to hate them. And therefore it's really hard to say, you know what? The people nearest and dearest, there's hate towards them too. That's hard to face.
Well, part of the reason why it's so hard to face is because it's so potentially disruptive. So I'll just share, I have someone very close to me in my family who I have issues with, but in my dealings with this person, I keep things very light, loving, and surface level because if I was honest, even in my own thinking about all the ways in which I feel hurt by this person, then I'm not going to be so sunny when I'm with them. And I need to be sunny, I tell myself, to keep the relationship together. And so if I'm honest about how much hate is there, then it's going to cause me to behave differently, less sunny. And I don't want that because I don't want to break the relationship with this person that I love. So it's so disruptive when you look. And that's part of why we don't.
I think that's part of it. I think more at that's true. And I think at the very heart of it is we are disturbed that that lives within us. So we want to look within ourselves and see love, good intentions, kindness, supportiveness. We don't want to look inside and see something that's darker and colder living in us. So I think that's the heart of it. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, we don't want to have that love and hate appear in our relationships because that's going to wreak havoc. But let me just finish up the section because the section says you have to look even if it's frightening. So even if it messes with your self-perception that you're so good and well-intentioned and spiritual, you have to look. So here's what he says in the closing paragraph. He says, your hatred is not real, but it is real to you. It hides what you really want. And that whole sentence was emphasized in Helen's notes. It hides what you really want. Surely you are willing to look upon what you do not want without fear, even if it frightens you, if you can thereby get rid of it. So he's saying, okay, I know this is scary to you, but you can look as calmly as you can upon it, and you should be motivated because this blocks everything you truly want, and this is the way to get rid of it. So the point is that yeah, it's scary to look, but this is looking is the way to get rid of it, and getting rid of it is the gateway to everything you really want. And the example that came to my mind, and it might be it's in the old Cameo, I think, is imagine that there's an X-ray that your doctor has, and on this X-ray is a worrying tumor. Yeah, it's scary to see that in the X-ray. Let's say your doctor puts it up on that illuminating panel, and you're like, oh gosh, this is scary to see. I see it right there. But you also want to look because unless you look, there's no surgery. And without the surgery, you don't want to know where it's going to go. So it's just like that. This is like a tumor in us. And okay, it's frightening that it's there, but aren't we motivated to look because then the tumor can be surgically removed? And that's what we want.
You're right. If you don't look, if you ignore, then if you have cancer, oftentimes it metastasizes, right? You're not looking and or you don't find it early enough and it takes over. The same thing is going on with our hate. If we're not actually looking at it and dissolving it, then it can take over and then we don't even our lives are in a state of disrepair and we're still not willing to look, right? It's still a situation where hatred has caused our lives to be in ashes, and it's still the other person's fault because we're so consumed by the hatred that has metastasized all over our mind, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And somehow we're always right. But if those people that we are always right about, if they got together and commiserated, they'd have a lot of agreement about the shape of our ego, wouldn't they?
Mm-hmm. So I promised a minute ago the uplifting escape from this idea, and is that enough, just looking, or what's the thing that we should actually do next to free ourselves from this hatred?
I think the looking done right kind of entails the rest. So if we really look, what we'll see is something we don't want in our minds. We'll see that, he talks about, you don't want that in your holy mind. It not only is ugly to have in our mind, but it covers our love. And we all want to be loving. So it turns out that love is already in us. We don't need to import it from somewhere, right? It's already there. And if there's something that covers it, something ugly, we don't want that. And
And that is
so that's that motivation is naturally going to lead to letting the hate go.
and that's the liberating message, because if you're taking responsibility for the hate within your own mind, then you have control over that, and you can make new decisions in the direction of love that could change everything, could heal the relationships that are broken, and make your life a happier experience. But if it's always their fault, then it's always outside of your control, and you're always at the effect of what other people do. But if you're looking at your own part, then you can clear it out, and that is liberating.
Imagine taking that cover off and finding that there is a wellspring of love within you that is strong and pure and free flowing. Wouldn't that be amazing? We all want to see ourselves as fundamentally good, which means fundamentally loving. And what Jesus is saying here is that's all true, but unless you take that cover off, you won't know it.
Yeah, that's the classic dichotomy of the course, where in the end, who we are as God created us, underneath all of the hate and the ego that's in us, is exalted and innocent and pure and beautiful. And yet we've got this thick layer of ego that we have to bust through in order to let that love in us shine through. Okay, you were saying earlier that to me that this section, when Helen took it down, sent, quote, shockwaves and echoes into the minds of Helen and Bill. So shockwaves into Helen and Bill's mind, and echoes into the sections of the course that came after. And so I let's talk about that. What was it about this material that was so shocking to the two of them?
Well, I think I'd like to cover those echoes in the text first because the shock waves are like the juicy part. So anyway, so in terms of the text, the very next section, which we've titled "Looking at the Cause of Fear" in the CE, it's really a continuation of the very same discussion. If you read that section, you realize, oh, he's talking all throughout it. He's talking about taking off the covers and looking at what you're afraid of, that you're hiding under the heavy blankets, and refusing to look at it. And we're embarking on this well organized program of looking at everything you do not want. He's talking about all the same stuff throughout the following section, but you don't really know what he's talking about. Like, what am I supposed to look at? What's so frightening that I'm not looking at? You only know all that if you know the previous section. Okay. You know that it's looking upon your hatred, which, as that section says, that what we're talking about, which frightens you. Okay. So that's one of the echoes. The following section grows out of the section that Helen and Bill left out. And then, so importantly, the fear of redemption section in chapter 13, which I think is a really important section, opens by saying, you may wonder why it is so crucial that you look upon your hatred and realize its full extent. Well, that is a direct reference back to the journey into fear section that we're talking about, and nowhere else in the course. He's referring specifically to that section, which talks about the need to look upon our hatred and the fact that we don't realize its full extent. You do not realize how much you hate your brother. And that section even says, and you may think that it would be easy enough for the Holy Spirit to show it to you and dispel it without the need for you to raise it to awareness yourself. So he is basically, and I think maybe in the original dictation, he may have said, you wonder why it is so crucial. So he's speaking to Helen and Bill saying, in response to this section we're talking about, saying, like, do we really have to? This sounds so hard. Can't the Holy Spirit just do it for us?
I want to put a pin in that because I
Okay.
think that's something that many of us think like, oh, can't the Holy Spirit just come in and take this away from me?
Yeah.
And can you speak to why the Course says he won't?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is a novel answer that that section, The Fear of Redemption, gives about why we have to look, which I don't think we should go into, but it's a powerful answer. So I'll just kind of tease it and leave it there. But the big answer he's already given, which is you can't you can't deny something in the sense of saying no to it unless you first stop denying it in the sense of now you're looking on it at it. It's like the trash thing. You have to look at it before you can get rid of it. That's, I think, very logical and very commonsensical.
Is the answer that you wouldn't give a minute ago that for the Holy Spirit to step in and take away our hate is a violation of our free will? We have to give it up
No,
willingly.
I think that's true. It's just not what's said in the fear of redemption section. What he says in the fear of redemption section is that you have to look at your hate, which you're afraid of, because underneath that is what you're really afraid of, which is the love in you.
Hmm.
So I remember teaching this section way back in the 80s, and the entire room is like, so what is this thing that we're really afraid of? It's underneath the hate. And when he actually gets to it and says, you're afraid of the love in you, I mean, everyone freaked out.
I totally know why you did not want to divulge that because
Now
my
you want to
instinct
park
is to
there.
be like, why are we afraid of love? I will not do that to you
Yeah.
though. So let's go on to continuing down this thread of why this was so frightening to Helen and Bill and the repercussions of that.
Yeah, so this is so fascinating. And this is something that we discovered, you and me, in Bill's journal a couple of years ago or so, which is amazing. So his journal, taken down at the same time, has a heading saying notes covering September 13th and 14th. The notes Helen took down September 13th and 14th, they're the very paragraphs we're talking about. So here's what
The
Bill
journey
says.
into fear section.
Yes. So Bill says these have been turbulent days, these 2 days, and crucial ones in terms of course application. In many respects, they have not been different from most of the days in the last few months and year, but as of now, I do feel that we have made some very significant progress, which I think he was a little bit, it didn't turn out to be true, but since we have made it, the worst that could happen would be temporary vacillation and dissociation of what has become compellingly real. I have been there so many times where you think, this is the breakthrough. And then 3 weeks later, you're like, oh, yeah, what was that? Um,
Mm-hmm.
anyway, he says Tuesday and Wednesday afternoons, and that's the 13th and 14th, the very same days we're talking about, were spent exclusively on attempts to face and understand fear and mutual hostility. That's the hate, their hate of each other. Helen was in a great panic about this and found everything associated with our collaboration fraught with fear and danger. However, the main change has been the very clear cut recognition expressed by her to me last night via phone that she no longer saw anything fearful about the most recent notes. And again, that's these 4 paragraphs we're talking about. It is apparent to both of us that an explicit statement of a problem, namely our ambivalent, meaning love hate, attitudes toward each other, can only lead to a constructive resolution of this long-standing conflict. So they ended up on this place where no, the notes are not terrifying, but actually constructive because now they name the problem that we have this love hate relationship. And only by naming it can we resolve this conflict. So that all seems really hopeful. But we know the relationship didn't turn here and start heading upwards, unfortunately. But what's so interesting to me about this is that in the section, Jesus says that looking at your hate would be frightening. And that's exactly what happened. Helen and Bill are trying to look at their mutual hostility, and this throws Helen into a panic. She feels that everything associated with their collaboration is fraught with fear and danger. And, they're freaking out. And it's exactly what Jesus predicted. He knows how hard it is for us to look at this.
These paragraphs are so fascinating, and it's even more fascinating when you throw in the layer of Helen and Bill, because how often are we in these interpersonal dynamics with people where we love them, we're really drawn to them, as the section says, and at the same time, love is not the only emotion that we're feeling. We're feeling that hatred. And Helen and Bill, to see Helen and Bill in that exact same dynamic where they were incredibly drawn to one another. They loved one another deeply, and there was all this hate there. And Jesus's response to that is not, you know, do all these other things, but do this thing. Look at your hatred so that you can dissolve it and the love is underneath. Now, as you said, it didn't quite work out. Bill was a little too optimistic in his predictions of success, because in the end, their relationship didn't turn around. Helen
Ever.
did snap back to being in a fearful place, and we think that Helen snapping back into that fearful place is the reason why this material never made it into the course proper.
We can't know, but there are other places. There's a pattern here where Helen is really uncomfortable with some material, and oh, whoops, it either never makes it into the course or it gets taken out. So she admits in her notebooks to being very uneasy with the sex material. And by the time the course is published, all references to sex are removed or changed. None of them remain. She admits that she did not like Jesus asking her to leave the minutia in her life, like shopping for a fur coat, to him. And that important teaching did not even leave her notebooks. It didn't get dictated into the text. So there's a pattern there, and it just seems very suspicious that she freaks over this material. And even though it gets referenced, the next section relies on this material, even though a later section relies on this material, even though a hole is left by leaving it out, it gets left out. Unlike some other sections like I Need Do Nothing that had a whole personal dimension that make it in. There's a number of those. So what's going on here? It's very tempting to think that there's a whole picture. And the whole picture is Jesus says you need to look at your hate even toward someone you love because it's covering your love. And this is the only way to liberate that love. But it's going to scare you. He says it's going to scare you. And then they are scared, especially Helen is scared. And then magically,
Yeah.
it doesn't ever make it into the course.
How ironic that the very thing that he's asking them to do, look, means that it's that they in the end don't look, and the material's removed so none of us can look.
That's funny. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, this really, it seems, threw Helen quite a panic, as Bill reports. Do do you want to? I know we're getting to the top of the hour here. Do you want to move on to any personal reflections you have about this teaching, and where we can incorporate it in our lives to actually do something different as a result of what we've learned today?
The practical thing is we need to start facing this in us. Like something in our mind says, yeah, I'm fine with that person. I've forgiven. I just want to flick them away and maybe flick them to the point where they land in, a horrible place. Or I'm fine with that person, but I do really gain pleasure when they take a fall and where all of their sins come crashing down on them, like I told them would happen. Yeah, I'm fine with that person, but I would love for everyone I know to look scornfully upon them like I do because I've told them everything. We need to start looking at those things as not, I'm fine with them, I'm just kind of neutral, but looking upon those things as our hate and saying, hey, that's ugly.
Mhm.
Maybe the way for me to find the love that I'm looking for in me is to look at that stuff, to realize how ultimately cold and reptilian it is, and to say, I'm not okay with the presence of something that ugly in my mind, and realize that if I'm not okay, that's the moment I liberate the love that's already in me. I don't need to put it there. It's already there waiting at the dam I've built.
One of the questions that we get a lot in relation to these ideas is, at what point do I give up? In other words, at what point do I realize that this relationship is not going to work no matter how much I look at my hate and change? And so I want to just to speak to that quickly, because that is something that we were talking about earlier that I found particularly interesting. I genuinely think that our work here with the course is to look at our stuff, to change how we show up in relationship. And as we do that, we dissolve our ego, strengthen the love, and things do turn around. And and I believe in that so wholeheartedly. And as I keep saying, I think there's a spiritual power in that too. I think God works through us in really beautiful, miraculous ways when we own our side of the street. And at the same time, where you can where I think it can go off the rails is when you think that you doing everything for the relationship, like you do your part for both of you. And if you just, this is one thing I hear so often, if I do my part good enough, I can pull this other person into a new place. And that's the spiritual thing. That's the course thing. And I just want to I want to say two things about that. One is that absolutely can happen. It can happen, and I have faith that it can happen. The second thing is sometimes it doesn't. And how you know to how to distinguish between the two is if the other person is willing to work with you. What I don't want to see people get into is these dynamics where you think that you being the spiritual one will change them in ways that they're unwilling to change. And that's the thing to be on the lookout for. But if you are stepping into owning your hatred, looking at your stuff, and they're willing to do the same, my goodness, that's incredible spiritual growth that can happen between two people. But both people need to be willing to look, otherwise it's not really going to work.
That's true, but I want to add on a third. I mean, I agree with all that totally. And I've often been, you know, of the mindset that if I do my part, that's enough. But I mean, and your part is doing your part is never going to be complete. You're always going to be ambivalent and torn, and you're always going to be able to tell yourself, well, if I just did my part better. And sometimes you're not going to be able to do your part better. And sometimes, doing your part better is still not enough. But what I would say is don't be naive about all that, just like you said. And even if it doesn't work, still do your part afterwards. That's crucial. Like don't just say, okay, it didn't work, and now my hate has
Free reign.
license to run rampant. Yeah, because there's something in us. I don't think humanity as yet, certainly not course students, certainly not spiritual students, has yet grasped this whole thing of really being willing to look at that reptile in us. So be aware that that thing in you is going to want to latch on to any excuse to give itself cover and
Mm.
and say no.
Yeah. I Yeah, we'll close it there. But I think that's a beautiful way to end. Always do your part. Always do your part, no matter what happens. Because I think that's where the spiritual power lives. I think God sees that. And I think it's rewarded in one of two ways. Either the other person does change or your external circumstances change. But either way, it's no reason to let the hate take over with another person, regardless of the dynamics of the relationship that preceded. You know, okay. All right. Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much to everyone who has joined us live for our recording of Exploring A Course in Miracles podcast. If you would like to be part of our live recordings, you are more than welcome to join us by joining our community, either through Course Companions or our Discovery tier for those who are just curious about what we do here and are just getting started with A Course in Miracles. You can find both of those tiers in our community page at circleofa.org/community. And we hope that you can join us for a future podcast. Bye for now.